One life. Who was Jesus? I want to start with a poem by a chap called James Allan Francis. And this is a poem about Jesus. See what you make of it. He was born in an obscure village. The child of a peasant woman, he grew up in still another village where he worked until he was 30. Then for 3 years he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a home. He didn't go to college. He never travelled more than 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things one usually associates with greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to the cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 centuries have come and gone, and today he is the central figure of the human race, the leader of mankind's progress. All the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man on earth as much as that one solitary life. I don't know what you make of the conclusion of that poem, but one thing is for sure. The life of Jesus has had a very big impact on human history. But who is he? Ask people on the street. Go onto the street and say, who is Jesus? Who do you reckon Jesus is? Apart from them thinking you're absolutely mad asking that question, imagine what their answers might be if they gave you a little bit of time to think about what the answer might be. I guess we'd get all sorts of different answers. Some, I think, would say that he's a myth. He never really existed. Others would say, no, he existed, but he was a great teacher, a good, well-meaning man, lots to learn from, but nothing more than that. Plenty of people would probably say, look, I have absolutely no idea. And other people would say, Jesus, he is the Saviour. He is God himself. It's an important thing to get a person's identity right. My regular walk from home here in Hampton Hill up to St Michael's takes me along a path between a golf course and the railway tracks. And there's a sort of narrow path. It's a lovely little path which with sort of bushes either side, which I go up most days outside of COVID. And one day I saw in the distance a friend of mine, Carlos, on a bike, cycling up one end of the path. And I thought I'd better get out of the way to start with. And then I thought I'd greet him, just like, one would normally greet a friend. And I just gave him a clap and said, here's the man. And then I looked up and this cyclist who was Carlos turned out not to be Carlos. And it turned out to be someone rather alarmed, thinking, who on earth is this person who's given me a round of applause saying, here's the man on this path. And this person sort of shot off and it was all a little bit embarrassing. Getting someone's identity can be quite a problem. Now that was embarrassing, but not a particularly big deal. I'll probably stop someone ever going down that path again. But getting Jesus' identity right, that is much more important. That is a really significant question, because if he never existed, or even if he was just a great teacher, then he might be able to inspire us, like any good story inspires us. But that's probably about it. Whereas if he is God himself, if he is the Saviour of this world, that is a big deal. The stakes are pretty high when it comes to Jesus. But how can we know? How can we know who he is and what he's like? And the answer to that question, I think, is the answer to that question for anyone. How can we know how anyone's like? We need to look at the evidence. I used to be a history teacher, and for 7 years I spent my life encouraging people to look at historical evidence in order to come to their conclusions. What was Napoleon like? What was Churchill like? What was Margaret Thatcher like? We need to look at the evidence and then come to a conclusion. And I think it's the same with Jesus. We need to look at the historical evidence to work out who he is. Now, to start with, let's think about this first question. What is the evidence that he actually existed? And for that, I think it's fair to say no serious historian would doubt the existence of Jesus. There's just too much evidence. I mean, if you look at just evidence from outside the Bible, there is plenty of it. The Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, they both wrote about him. And the first century historian Josephus, he described Jesus and his followers like this. He said, "Now there were about this time, Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles." So even outside the Bible, there seems to be some good, solid historical evidence that Jesus existed. But there is also the evidence of the New Testament itself. Now, next question. How can we trust the evidence of the New Testament? How do we know that, to start with, what we have today, here's a copy of the Bible, the last third is the New Testament. How do we know that the pages we have here are the same things as was what was originally written down way back in the first century? Perhaps the New Testament documents have been embellished over the centuries, over the years, exaggerated, that Jesus has been sort of transformed from being this great teacher into some sort of God. Is that possible? Well, here it is important for us to go to something known as textual criticism. And that can be a really helpful way of us having confidence in the Bible that we have today. Let me just explain a little bit about textual criticism. The idea behind textual criticism is to think about the time span between the date of the manuscript that we still have and the earliest available copies. And the more text we have, the better as well. And the higher the quality of the existing text, the better as well. So let me explain. Let's give some examples of this. So some ancient literature. Here's a chart coming up on the screen. And here's some ancient literature which people look at today. So Herodotus, apologies for my pronunciation, he wrote a histories written, as believed, in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy of that we have is AD 900. Now that's a 1300 time span gap, and we have 8 copies of that earliest copy. Then there's Thucydides, writing around the same time as Herodotus, and again the 5th century BC, and the earliest copies we have of his histories, we have about 8 of them, and that's AD 900. So there's a gap of 1300 years between when the document was written and the earliest documents, the manuscripts that we have. For Tacitus and his histories, which were written around AD 100, the earliest copy we have is AD 1100, so a time span of 1,000 years, and about 20 copies of those manuscripts. Caesar's Gallic War, written 58 to 50 BC, the earliest copies are around AD 900, so 950 year gap. We've got 9-10 of those copies. Livy's Roman Histories, written around the turn of the millennium, earliest copies 900 AD, again a 900 year time span, about 20 copies there. And then look at the New Testament, written between 40 and 100 AD, with the earliest fragments that we have still around, dated from 130 AD. We have full manuscripts from 350 AD, so basically a 300 year time span from when it was written to what the earliest copies that we have. And we have about over 5,000 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, 9,300 others. An enormous number. Now, the point is this: no classical scholar doubts the authenticity of those other works, despite the large time gap and the relatively small number of manuscripts. And so with the New Testament, we can be enormously confident that what we have now is what was written then. The textual critic, F.J.A. Hort, writes this: "In the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone among ancient prose writings." So I'd argue there is a remarkable authenticity and integrity to the New Testament that we have now. Now, what does it say about Jesus though? What does the New Testament say about Jesus? The first thing it shows us is that Jesus was a human being. It tells us about his humanity. It tells us he was born as a baby and grew up like any human being. He got tired, he got hungry, he got thirsty. He knew what it was to experience grief and sadness. He had a job, he was tempted, he experienced suffering, he experienced death. So far, so normal. But the New Testament paints the picture of someone who is not just fully human, but also someone who is fully God. The story is told of the 1920s American president Calvin Coolidge, who was known as Silent Cal because he was a man of famously few words. And at one dinner party, he sat next to a woman called Dorothy Parker, who tried to strike up a conversation by saying, "Mr. Coolidge, I've made a bet against someone who said it was impossible to get more than 2 words out of you." And Coolidge just turned to her and simply said, "You lose," and then remained silent for the rest of the evening, not uttering one word. Silent Cal. Not great company. Sometimes it can be possible to think of God in a similar way, as someone who is similarly sort of aloof and distant, sort of silent God. But Jesus says, according to the New Testament, God is not silent, because I am God. I've come to reveal who God is. I've come to show you who he is. I am God with human flesh. It's worth thinking a little bit about some of the words that Jesus says which point to his identity, to who he is. So in a world where people hunger for love and security and significance and meaning, Jesus said, "I am the bread of life." In a world which struggles with so many different addictions, Jesus said, "If the Son," speaking of himself, "if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." In a world where so many are struggling with depression and a sense of darkness, not least in these COVID times, Jesus said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." In a world where people are so full of weary and tired, Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." In a world where 1 out of 1 people die, Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die." It is a very striking thing that Jesus doesn't point away from himself when he speaks of God. Most religious teachers would do that. They would speak of God by pointing to God, whereas Jesus, the most humble man, said, "Look at me." He speaks about, "I am the bread of life. If the Son, me, I can set you free. I am the light of the world. I will give you rest. I am the resurrection and the life. Huge things to say. And it gets even more explicit in Jesus' offer to forgive sins. On one occasion, some people brought a paralyzed man to Jesus and they wanted him to heal him. But Jesus very strikingly says to this man, he says, your sins are forgiven. And there were some religious leaders listening in on to this. And they were appalled to hear this. They were outraged and they said, why does this man talk like this? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And they're right, in the sense that only God can forgive sins, because sins by their definition are committed against God. You can only forgive someone something when you are the person who has been wronged. So for example, if I forgot to buy my wife Sally a Christmas present, it wouldn't be for my children to say, don't worry Dad, we forgive you. It'd be for my wife to say, don't worry, I forgive you, because I'd wronged her. And only God can forgive sins. And here is Jesus saying, I forgive sins. It's not surprising that he was accused of blasphemy. Incidentally, he then went on to prove that he could forgive sins when he healed the paralyzed man. And there are lots of other examples of Jesus acting not simply as a human being, but taking on that title of God. One occasion, a disciple of his, Thomas, came before him kneeling and said, my Lord and my God. And Jesus didn't say, no, you made a terrible mistake, I'm not God. Rather, he said, well, because you have seen me, you have believed, and blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Jesus made some very big claims for himself, which presents us with something that C.S. Lewis called a trilemma. Listen to these words of C.S. Lewis. He said this: a man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either he was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something else. You can shut him up for a fool, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that option open to us. He did not intend to. Or put another way, he's either a liar, he's a lunatic, or he's Lord. That's the trilemma. So how do we decide? How do we decide? Jesus can say all these things, but how do we decide whether he's a liar, lunatic, or Lord? And I think at this point it's really helpful to look at the evidence around his life, not just his words about himself. And for this, let me finally, as we close, draw your attention to his teaching, his character, Old Testament prophecies and his miracles and his resurrection. Firstly, his teaching. The teaching of Jesus is acknowledged by many to be the greatest teaching ever spoken by a human being. One doesn't need to be a Christian to acknowledge this. His call to love our enemies, to turn the other cheek, to do to others what we would have them do to us, to love our neighbours, the parable of the Good Samaritan. I've been reading recently this book by Tom Holland called Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. And he speaks of the way in which Jesus' teaching has fundamentally changed and shaped the world in which we live today. Human rights, the equal dignity and worth of all human beings, our concern for the poor, the vital place of sacrifice and forgiveness, all of that stems from Jesus' teaching and Jesus' life. And over the past 2,000 years, humanity has made progress in virtually every field: scientific, technological, our knowledge about the world. We can travel further and faster than ever before. We can vaccinate a whole world, hopefully, against horrible diseases. But no one has improved upon the moral, ethical teaching of Jesus. So that's his teaching. Secondly, his character. It's well worth actually reading through a gospel account of Jesus' life and just seeing his character. He loved the marginalised, he fed the hungry, he healed the sick, he befriended the outcast of society. He described himself as being someone who is humble and gentle in heart. He had compassion on those he met, and yet he also was able to stand up against the powerful and those who oppressed others. He was tested in the most demanding circumstances. When he was hanging on a cross in absolute agony, he was still able to pray, "Father, forgive them." Speaking of his executioners, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. A remarkable character. And then there's his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. That's the first 2/3 of the Bible. And Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies, all spoken by different voices over the hundreds of years in which the Old Testament came to be. In fact, he fulfilled 29 of those Old Testament prophecies on one day, the day he died. Okay, we could say, well, Jesus just worked really hard to fulfill all these prophecies, but some of these prophecies were completely out of control, apart from the fact 300 is a lot of prophecies to try to fulfill. But they're prophecies about his birth, about his death, about his burial. Fourth, his miracles. If we read the New Testament, we'll see that Jesus did the most extraordinary miracles. He healed the sick, he gave sight to the blind, he turned water into wine, he fed thousands with one small picnic, he calmed the storm, he rose the dead. And whilst these miracles were acts of power, of the Creator's power, there were also signs of who he was and what he was coming to do. God coming into the world, a world full of disease, a world full of sadness and death, to put things right again. And I guess the ultimate sign, his teaching, his character, the fulfillment of Old Testament, his miracles, but the ultimate miracle is his resurrection. The physical resurrection of Jesus is the cornerstone, it's the foundation of the Christian faith. Certainly speaking personally, if Jesus had not risen from the dead, if I was persuaded that he had not risen from the dead, I would not be a Christian, because the whole thing unravels. This is the crucial piece of evidence to my mind. Because if Jesus had risen from the dead, as Christians claim, and as I believe the evidence shows that he has, it does change everything. It means that there is life beyond death. It means that this is not all there is. It means that Jesus' promise to restore all things holds true, because he kept his promise to be the first part of that, rising himself from the dead. And it means that Jesus is still alive today, that we can have a meaningful relationship with him by his Spirit. So now, is this all just wishful thinking? Is this all just crazy think? Because dead people surely don't rise again. People back then knew that as well as we know that now. And again here, I think let's look at the evidence. Now let me just give you a teaser for this. We could discuss this a little bit later on. But I think there are three key pieces of evidence about Jesus' resurrection. The first is the empty tomb. His body was never found. And to my mind, there are no good explanations for what happened to his body. Secondly, his appearances. He appeared to his disciples on 11 different occasions. They touched him. They ate with him. He even cooked breakfast for them. And over 500 people are recorded as having seen him. And thirdly, and this is almost the most persuasive one to my mind, is the transformation of the disciples. You've got to think about the disciples on the day that Jesus died. They were scattered. They were all over the place. They were devastated. They'd put all their hopes in Jesus. They did not expect it to end like this, on a cross, aged 33, in humiliation. And actually, we're told they were locked themselves in an upstairs room in Jerusalem. And yet, 50 days later, they are out preaching that Jesus had risen from the dead, and thousands were becoming Christians. And then if you look at the history of the church since then, how the church erupted, read through the book of Acts, and the extraordinary transformation that took place in these disciples, many of whom died for their faith. And if they hadn't believed Jesus rose from the dead, why would you die for a lie? So that's a whistle-top tour of who Jesus is and the evidence for that. Who he is really the key question for us to ask. I think the evidence points to Jesus as God himself, who came to reveal God to us, who came to rescue us, and came to restore all things. That's it from me for now. We're now going to have a chance to discuss all of this and see what you make of it in our groups.